To open my lesson this morning, I'd like to take you back to August 17th, 1790. On that date, a letter was written to George Washington by the warden of the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island. And they were expressing the Jewish community's esteem for George Washington. The congregation wrote of its pleasure that the God of Israel, who had protected King David, had also protected George Washington. And what pleased the congregation most was that while Jews in the rest of the world lived under the rule of cruel monarchs, the Newport congregation lived under a government that was elected by its citizens. And President Washington responded to their letter with these remarks, which I found in the National Archives of America. And I quote President Washington. Of course, it's in his Old English, so bear with me. But George Washington said, "It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of other inhabitants, while every one shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." And then he continues, "May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlasting happy." Under the vines and the fig trees is what I want us to consider this morning. I took my thoughts from a Brother Padfield, a gospel preacher, who said this about George Washington. One thing that always amazed him, he said, about the founding fathers of America was their use and mastery of Old Testament language. When I read that, I thought it's a shame our political leaders of today don't practice the same thing. But Mr. Washington, in his reply, was quoting the prophet Micah. Micah was the prophet for the poor and the downtrodden. Micah was a man of courage. Within him dwelt a fearless spirit. He saw clearly the conditions and sins, not of the people, but more of the rulers and the prophets and the priests of his day. And to them he says this. He says, "Therefore, on account of you, Zion," on account of you, speaking to the priests, he says, "Zion will be plowed as a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the people will become high places of a forest." Now, in contrast to this condemnation, Micah goes on to speak, though, of God's promise of future blessings for his faithful people and the destruction of their enemies. He said in chapter 4, verses 1 to 5, Micah says, "And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, It will be raised above the hills, and the people will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth the law, even the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations. Then they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they train for war. Each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Though all the prophets walk, each in the name of his God, as for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord, our God, forever and ever. Micah here now is speaking of the glorious messianic promise, which would bring to end the Jewish age and usher in the new era of the Messiah. And Micah saw, instead of war and destruction, he says that everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree. Why would Micah describe the messianic dispensation in this manner? Well, this phrase, sitting under one's vine and fig tree, was a symbol of peace and security. And having said that, the same description, is used to describe the peaceful times during the reign of King Solomon. In 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 24 and 25, we read there, speaking of Solomon, "For he had dominion over everything west of the river, from Tifsas even to Gaza, over all the kings west of the river, and he had peace on all sides around about him. So Judah and Israel lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon." King Solomon certainly would have understood the meaning of this phrase. He understood the serenity of a garden, one with vines and fig trees. His gardens were more than just a luxurious feature, pleasing to the eye. They were a place of reflection. It was a place of royal decision-making. It was a place to reflect upon his spiritual blessings. And God used nature, I believe, to reveal truths to us throughout the Bible. For example, think of the parable of the sower. I believe God used nature as a teaching tool because his fingerprints are in it. If we stop a minute and behold it, we'll see its spiritual usefulness and its beauty. We live in a man-made jungle. Man's fingerprints are in his brick and mortar structures. And there's not much spirituality drawn from them, is there? Now, when we speak of grapevines, we picture cultivated rows of grapes found in a winery. But in ancient Bible lands, they were also left to grow wild, allowing them to climb up trellises and around windows where they could be used for shade in the hot summer nights. And due to Palestine's continual bright sunshine and heavy dew in the late summer nights, grapevines flourished. Vines were also desired for one's daily intake of grape juice. And I learned something interesting about vines in this lesson, that the best location for vines is on gentle slopes of a hillside. It offers better drainage, it offers protection from frost and improved sunlight exposure. And it's interesting that the prophet Jeremiah, speaking of the restoration of Samaria, speaks of it in this way. Jeremiah says in chapter 31 and verse 5, he says again, speaking of Samaria, again you will plant vineyards on the hills of Samaria. The planters will plant and enjoy them. On the hills, the planters will enjoy their labors. The prophet Amos also, like many of the prophets, speaks of the future blessings that are coming in the Messianic period, which will compensate for Israel's present punishments. And he describes those blessings in this manner. Amos says in chapter 9 and verse 13, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman will overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who sows seed, when the mountains will drip sweet wine, and all the hills will be dissolved." Think for a moment these descriptive phrases. For the plowman to overtake the reaper. Think about that. Plowing usually begins a month or so after harvest. And Amos is saying that the land would produce such an abundant harvest that farmers will still be gathering produce while it's time to plow. The plowing season is upon them. And think of the treader of grapes, him who sows seeds. With the overabundance of produce, one would still be treading grapes when the fresh seeding comes. As for their harvest, Amos says, it would seem as though the mountains themselves were flowing with rivers of sweet wine. Think about that. With their abundance, it would be like the hills were dissolving, were washing away from the excess of the flowing streams of wine. But Amos is explaining that God's promised restoration would be a total reversal of the punishment that he was bringing upon them at the time. And to the common farmer in those days, these scenes would be unimaginable, wouldn't they? To the faithful, the graces of God would be overwhelming, thinking of this. And let me share this interesting fact with you from the world of agriculture. It is stated that vineyards grow best under peaceful conditions. That seems like a pretty strange statement, doesn't it? Considering that vines are a plant. They don't think. But vines need constant care. A vineyard needs regular labor and upkeep. Constant pruning of the vines is necessary if the clusters of grapes are to grow to full maturity. And think about it, laborers cannot be preoccupied with war or other endeavors. They must remain focused. And to me, there's a huge spiritual lesson in the learning of that fact. And also in Bible times, every Jew desired to have his own vines. They would provide for the poor, as in Deuteronomy 23 and verse 24 says, "When you enter your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes until you are fully satisfied, but you shall not put any in your baskets. Fresh grapes were to be shared with others for their daily nutrition. And in 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 18, we read here, then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of wine, and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them on donkeys. With your own vines, okay, you were well supplied with dried raisins and unfermented grape juice. And in this case, in this story, selfish Nabal should have been the one offering this to King David, not his wife. And you know that story. And in Joel 1 and verse 5, we read there, Joel says, awake, drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you wine drinkers, on account of the sweet wine that is cut off from your mouth. Here we're being warned of God's blessings and abundance that can be abused by man. And as we see through their drunken desires for fermented wine. Grapes were a precious gift in Bible times. So much so that even today, the bounty of God's blessings is remembered. On the exterior wall of a synagogue in Chorazin, there is a mural that depicts this scene. You all know this story, don't we? In Numbers chapter 13, 21 to 24, there is recorded there the mission that Moses gave to Joshua and Caleb and the 10 spies. They entered the promised land, and upon returning, they described it as a land that flowed with milk and honey. And this would bring to their mind pleasure and plenty. And with them they brought back the abundance of the land, such as this cluster of grapes. And let's, for a minute, get a better perspective of the situation here using these maps. On these maps here, the Lord and Moses had freed and brought Israel out of the land of Egypt. And then for 15 months, we see here that they traveled through nothing but desert and barren land on their way to Kadesh Barnea. And we see here that they traveled through the mountainous areas, and fresh fruit was not on Israel's menu, was it? God gave them quail and manna for their diet. And on this map here, now we see that they are in Kadesh Barnea, where Joshua and Caleb organized the 10 spies in preparation to enter the promised land. And again, even here, they travel through barren land, desert area, on their way up to Beersheba. And at Beersheba, the land starts a transformation into a more fertile area. And near Mount Hebron, up here, is the valley of Eshcol, known as the Valley of Grapes. And here is where the spies found an overwhelming abundance of produce. And the 10 spies really should have been in awe, shouldn't they? Seeing firsthand God's blessings. But sadly to say, well, you know the rest of the story, don't you? Even today, this area produces an abundance of grapes, as we see here in this slide. And what I found interesting about this was the only free picture that I could find on Google. for the Eshcol Valley. But if you Google Eshcol Valley, you will see exactly what we just showed that the 10 spies brought back. Huge bunches of grapes. But like I say, I had to pay for them, so this is the best we get. But like the vine, fig trees were also valued for their fruit and their shade. And like the vine, it too became a symbol of security and prosperity. Zechariah speaks of that surety in Zechariah 3 and verse 10. Zechariah says, "In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor and sit under his vine and his fig tree." Zechariah 2 is speaking of the time of peace and security that will be coming with Christ. And as for fig trees, they were widespread through Palestine. They're slow growing. They required many years to reach full maturity, and the fig became symbolic of the economic and the political stability in the land. Remember the description of the life under Solomon's rule in 1 Kings 4 and 25? So Judah and Israel lived in safety, every man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Now, it's interesting to note that this descriptive phrase, under the vines and figs, became known and was also used by Gentile kings, but not in the manner that God intended. Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, used the same language in 701 BC when he promised the inhabitants of Jerusalem peace and security if they would rebel against Hezekiah and surrender to him. Remember last week, Jeremy spoke of this. And as for the time period now, we've advanced about 259 years from the reign of Solomon. Hezekiah is now king in Judah, and Hezekiah is a godly king, putting his trust in the God of Israel. And in his 4th year on the throne, Hezekiah had refused to pay tribute to the earlier king Shalmaneser. Then in Hezekiah's 14th year on the throne, Sennacherib became king in Assyria. And Sennacherib was not at all impressed with Hezekiah's defiance towards Assyria. And so he sets out on a campaign of war against Israel, beginning with the smaller cities of Judah, in hopes of intimidating Jerusalem, thus making it easier for him to take it down. And when he comes to Jerusalem, Hezekiah, a man, as man often does, forgets God's power. And in fear, he offers Sennacherib a bribe, using the temple gold and silver and the treasures of his house as a bribe for the safety of Jerusalem. And Sennacherib takes that bribe, but then he turns around and he lays siege to Jerusalem anyway. And then he sends 3 of his Assyrian officers to the walls of Jerusalem to taunt and deceive the Jewish people with promises and mockery. And we read that scene in 2 Kings 18, verses 31 to 32. These are the men that Sennacherib has sent to Jerusalem. And they say, "Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me, and come out to me, and eat each of his vine and each of his fig tree, and drink each of the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die. But do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Here, Sennacherib is offering them a picture of security and daily peace. Drinking water from their own cisterns, which would have been a privilege for the common man of that day, and also vines and figs. Sennacherib was no fool. He knew the power of painting a picture before the people's minds of abundant nature at her finest. And this taunting and mockery, though, helped Hezekiah to come to his senses. He then realizes his error, and he humbly seeks the help of the God of Israel, from whom true peace and security is found. And God answered Hezekiah's prayer. God shows Hezekiah who has the power to give true peace and security. And he goes on to show Sennacherib who is the true God. In 2 Kings 19:32-37, we read this. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to this city or shoot an arrow there, and he will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same he will return. And he shall not come to this city, declares the Lord, for I will defend this city and save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. And then it happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. And it came about, as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adremelech and Sharezer killed him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat, and Esarhaddon his son became king in his place. Sennacherib had promised peace and security, but couldn't deliver. And for his mockery of the power of God, the Lord took his life. And Hezekiah and Israel should have, in the beginning, put their trust in God for peace and security. If you recall back in Deuteronomy 28, Moses had laid out the directions for obtaining true peace and security and serenity, and it would come from God. And they were obtained through obedience. And Moses names each one of them. Moses said, blessed shall you be in the city. Blessed shall you be in the country, in your offspring and the produce of your land, your offspring of your beasts, increase of your herds. And blessed shall you be in your basket and kneading bowl, in your comings and your goings. Moses and the Lord promised this to Israel in the beginning. And Hezekiah and the people had forgotten that. They had forgotten that with obedience, Israel would abound, and prosperity and peace and security would come to them. It was a forgotten fact by Israel. And how sad that is. I find it interesting, though, how sometimes experiences in our lives bring to mind our forgotten spiritual facts. At the time I began putting this lesson together, you remember when Phoebe was still here, we took her to Niagara Falls, Tammy and I, knowing that she was leaving Canada. We wanted to do something exciting with her, and so we traveled down to the falls. And nearing the end of our day, I decided to come back through Niagara-on-the-Lake before the sun came down. I thought it'd be nice to take her through that area. Growing up there, I always remember the beauty of it. And this picture that I found helps us a bit with my point, to bring to our minds the awe that we felt as we drove along in the quiet that evening, viewing some of the old Victorian-style homes of the early 1900s with their wraparound porches and the large old trees in their yards that were perfectly kept, gardens all neatly looked after. And surrounding that beauty were the acres of evenly laid out rows of vineyards. And I found it interesting the different things that impressed each one of us as we drove through there. And as we chatted and looking at the beauty around us, we were moved, though, to reflect on the fact that this is all but for a fleeting time. The type of peace and security that had been built by a few generations of families in that area will be of no value at death's door. We can take nothing with us into eternity. And like the faithful remnant of Israel, we must remember also that God promised true and lasting peace and security. But in order to obtain that, we must follow him. And Jesus explained the difference in John 14, verse 27. Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Do not let your heart be troubled, nor let it be faithful." The peace of the world is not what it seems. There is a great difference between what the world offers and what Christ offers. In John 16 and verse 33, Jesus said, "These things I have spoken to you, so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation. But take courage, I have overcome the world." True peace is one of the fruits of the spirits. And remember the vineyard, that it flourished in times of peace? We too must cultivate our vineyard daily so that greater peace will be understood and produced. Peace for the soul can only come as we obey the Lord, pruning and caring for that relationship. The Apostle Paul encourages us to look to the Lord for true peace. In Philippians 4, verses 6 to 7, Paul says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." True peace comes from being reconciled to God, being secure in his favor. The peace that God offers is a peace, Paul says, that far surpasses human comprehension. God's peace goes far beyond our thoughts. God's peace is a peace that Christ has purchased for us. It guards our hearts and our thoughts from all want and all anxiety and despair. And the prophet Micah again wants us to consider something in Micah 4 verses 4 and 5. Again, each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid. For the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. Lo, all the peoples walk, each in the name of his God. As for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. Are you protected? Are we protected under God's vines and fig trees? You know, George Washington in the beginning used that Old Testament description. But I wonder, did he truly understand the peace and the security that he spoke of? And we need to remind ourselves that the peace and security that the world offers, you know, we can gain everything and it can be gone in an hour. And most of all, it'll end at death's door. It will be of no eternal value to us. And so the question that we're left with is, will we receive the peace and serenity that God has offered through his Son? And so if you take your hymn books, we turn to hymn number 19, the blue book. Oh, what?
I have the wrong number written up.
Oh.
4-4.
Oh, 444 in the blue books? Okay. And as we stand and sing, if you haven't committed yourself to Christ, if you're looking to find the peace and security that this world offers, you need to reconsider your choices and think about what God offers for eternity.